See if you can solve the following simple math problem. What is 1 plus 1? Sure, we all know the answer is 2, but here's a question. How do you know it? Probably you simply know the answer by experience. You take one of something, you take another of something, and when you count them up, you get 2, right? Well, let's take another example. What is 542,582 plus 457,418? You probably can't answer this question as quickly as you answered the first one, but if I gave you enough time, I'm sure you would come up with the correct answer. You would probably just realign the problem like so, and starting at the right, add the columns. 2 plus 8 is 10, so you put a 0 and carry the 1, and so on until you get the answer, 1 million. With the first problem, you knew the answer. But with the second problem, all you really knew to start was that you could find out the answer. Why was it that you didn't have to work out the first problem? Well, it is probably because it is a math problem you have been exposed to before. And you have been exposed to it enough times that you memorized the answer. Chances are, however, you were never exposed to the second problem. Or, if by chance you were exposed to it, it wasn't with enough frequency to have memorized the answer. Consequently, you didn't know the answer until you actually worked it out. But as it turns out, the answer was a pretty round number, 1 million. If you were to rewind this video right now, or even if you play it again in a week or a month from now, you would probably be able to solve both problems simply from what you already know. The study of what we know is called epistemology. It is a very complicated field that considers the things we know and how we know them. It's a branch of philosophy about which people have argued for many centuries, and it is not the focus of our course here. And yet, at the same time, as students of history, we need to be at least somewhat concerned with what we know, and more importantly, with why we say we know what we know. The first question we gave you was pretty easy. Here's another one that should be pretty simple. Who was the first president of the United States? You probably say that you know the answer to that question, even if you're not an American. But how do you know it? Did you ever meet George Washington? Were you alive when he was president? This is what epistemology is all about. You say you know the answer, but how do you know it? Now, we're not trying to cast doubt for you on who the first president was, but when you get right down to it, you can't know the answer in the same way that you know 1 plus 1 equals 2. That is, you can't know this truth by experience. You have to take someone's word for it. You probably learned from a book that George Washington was the first president, but how do you know that the book you read was correct? A great many people in this world have believed things because it was what others believed and have been proven wrong. You could go to the website of the United States National Archives and Record Administration and look up the Electoral College history for 1789 to see the vote totals. But how do you know you can trust the National Archives? At some point, you simply have to begin trusting that information you receive is true. But how do you make those decisions? Maybe you think you could just trust a newspaper account of the day. Let's apply that theory. Let's stay with American presidential politics and ask, who won the 1948 American presidential election? Well, if you went to the newspapers, you might uncover this front page from the Chicago Tribune, dated November 3rd, 1948. This famous picture shows President Harry Truman holding a copy of the Chicago Tribune from that date declaring Dewey defeats Truman. But maybe you also know that there never was a President Dewey in our country. If you don't know that, you can consult a list of all the American presidents and realize you have conflicting information. How can it be that a big city newspaper printed a headline that was wrong? It all comes down to, how do you know what to believe? And that is what this video is all about. In fact, you make decisions every day based on inputs you receive. You receive inputs in your brain from each of your 5 senses, and you use your brain to make an informed decision. Sometimes, however, the inputs you receive are in conflict with one another. You've probably heard for so long from so many people that George Washington was the first president of the United States that you agree that this is true. But what about Dewey and Truman? As we said, maybe you know that there never was a President Dewey, but how do you account for the newspaper article? Well, as it turns out, in November of 1948, the Tribune had recently installed a new type of press which required them to run the papers earlier than normal. They selected their headline based on the inclinations of a political reporter who had been right in his predictions of 4 of the last 5 elections. But this is just the point. The Chicago Tribune was so confident that it knew New York Governor Thomas Dewey would win the election that it tarnished its reputation and made a colossal error. And now that colossal error is part of the historical record. In the end, you see, there are many things we don't know for certain. We just believe them very strongly. This is true even for big city newspapers. In epistemology, philosophers make a big distinction between what we actually know and what we actually only believe, and it's important for us to understand the difference as well. It's one thing to make inquiries about history from just the last century, when we still have eyewitnesses that can tell us what they saw. But if we want to study history from as long as 2,000 years ago, how are we going to know what is true? We don't have any eyewitnesses left for events from so long ago. Instead, we have to rely on the objects that people who lived before us left behind. We call these objects artifacts. Artifacts come in various forms. Sometimes they are documents that people have written, such as books, newspaper articles, business receipts, or diaries. But artifacts can also be other objects, such as works of art, tools, or articles of clothing. Many times, even the trash people leave behind can be artifacts. And not every artifact has important information for a historian, but among the artifacts that are useful to our study of history, we generally divide them into 2 categories, called primary and secondary. An artifact conveying historical information is classified as a primary source if it represents the experience of an eyewitness to an event. A secondary source would be an artifact that does not represent an eyewitness experience. For example, if we historians uncovered a painting that was produced by Michelangelo, it would be a primary source in a study of that artist's life and work. However, if we found a copy of one of Michelangelo's paintings produced by an art student 100 years later, it might be a primary source if we were studying students of Michelangelo from that period, but it would not be a primary source for understanding the original artist. To better understand the difference between primary and secondary sources, let's consider an example. Suppose in the town where you live there was a dramatic fire that burned down a vacant warehouse. No one was hurt, but by all accounts the fire itself was a sight to behold. Flames shot high into the sky, and firefighters came from all the surrounding towns to help put the fire out. However, when the fire occurred, it just so happened that you were off visiting your grandmother in another state for a week. When you got back home, your best friend told you all about the fire. How big it was, how many firefighters were there putting it out, and all the details about what the various people in your town were doing when the fire erupted. Let's further suppose that both you and your friend wrote about the experience in your diaries, and those diaries were uncovered 100 years later by historians who wanted to know about the great fire in your town. The account that your friend wrote would be considered a primary source because your friend actually witnessed the fire and wrote down all the events as they happened. Your account might be riveting and dramatic, but it could never be considered a primary source about the fire because you weren't there to witness it. Remember, you were off visiting your grandmother at the time. Your account is secondhand because you wrote down what your friend saw. So whose account would be more valuable to an historian 100 years later? Be careful how you answer. In many cases, a primary source is considered better than a secondary source because the producer of the artifact has had personal experience with the events recorded. But that might not always be the case. Let's suppose your best friend is prone to wild exaggeration. You know this, and you've grown accustomed to take everything the friend tells you with a grain of salt. The story your friend told you, which agrees with the story in the friend's diary, speaks of flames that ran 5 miles high into the sky. Your friend also says that there were at least 10,000 firemen who worked to put out the fire, and the women of the town were all bawling their eyes out all night as the vacant warehouse burned to the ground. A very dramatic story, and when your friend told you this, you didn't quite believe all the facts. You could see the burned out warehouse, but you had reason to doubt what your friend actually reported. So you went further and asked a few more friends. From those other friends, you got reports a little less dramatic, but the reports of these other friends all agreed with each other. And so in the end, the account you wrote in your diary told of 60 firemen, flames that reached about 100 feet in the air, and one woman who cried, but only because she tripped over a fire hose and twisted her ankle. Now, let's suppose that after 100 years have passed, researchers studying the Great Fire came across the 2 diaries written by you and your friend. And as it happened, these were the only accounts to survive the Great Warehouse Fire. Your diary would be considered a secondary source because you admitted that you were reporting facts as they were reported to you. Remember, you weren't there when the fire happened. You were off at your grandmother's in another state. The friend's diary would be considered a primary source, since it would be easy to demonstrate that the friend had been an actual eyewitness to the fire. It would be the job of the historians to sort out the details and determine which story was a better representation of the facts. In general, the historical witness who is closer in time and location to an actual event is to be considered more reliable, but we still have to be careful when evaluating sources. Not only are there exaggerations in historical artifacts, as with your friend's diary, but sometimes the evidence actually lies, or the people creating the evidence may actually lie. Let me give you a real-world example from actual history. Ever since Christianity ceased to be against the law in Europe in the early 300s, there has been an ongoing struggle for power between representatives of the Church and representatives of the various national governments. In the year 1054, Pope Leo IX made reference to what is called the Donation of Constantine, which was a document supposedly drafted by the Roman Emperor Constantine back in the 300s. In the document, Constantine apparently granted tremendous rights and privileges to the popes of Rome. This document was received by many in Rome as a great primary source, establishing a precedent for the authority assumed by the various popes down through history. However, it turns out, actually beyond any shadow of a doubt, that the document was, in fact, not issued by Constantine, but was forged in the 8th century to give the impression that the 4th century emperor wanted the popes to have such authority. So how do we know if we can trust a document that supposedly comes down to us from the past? Well, first of all, we need to understand that lying has been a part of mankind's history since the beginning. Consider this photograph from the 20th century. The man in the middle of the photograph is Joseph Stalin, a former leader of the former Soviet Union. On the far right of the picture is Nikolai Yezhov, a close confidant of Stalin and head of the Soviet secret police. But at some point, Yezhov fell out of favor with Stalin, and so the following picture resulted. It's the same picture, but after Stalin had Yezhov killed for disagreeing with him, he also had Yezhov's image erased from the historical record. Does that shock you? Well, try to contain your moral outrage. For lest we think only the leaders of the former Soviet Union would commit such crimes against history, consider the following picture of William Tecumseh Sherman, Union general from the Civil War, seated with 7 of his subordinate generals. This photograph was taken by a famous Civil War-era photographer named Matthew Brady. Look carefully at the man sitting at the far right of the photograph. His name is General Francis P. Blair. He is important to the story of this photograph because he was unable to attend the photo shoot with Sherman and the other generals that day. Now, if you're paying attention, you should be asking yourself a question right now. How is it that General Blair could appear in a photograph if he wasn't there on the day they took the picture? It turns out that long before Photoshop became a verb in the English language, meaning to doctor a photograph, the well-respected Matthew Brady took a separate photo of Blair and worked him into the picture. Here's another shot of the same photo shoot without Blair. Notice too that it wasn't just Blair's image that was added to the picture. The nice velvet curtain is missing in the original as well. So when we evaluate history, we need to be careful in forming our opinions because sometimes people lie. Sometimes they intentionally fabricate stories or other evidence to make a story appear a certain way. Sometimes the authors of primary sources may also choose to leave out certain details in order to affect the impression of a reader. But other times there are accounts that are taken as true history when they were never actually intended to be received as true. For example, we have probably all heard the stories of Christopher Columbus sailing the ocean blue in 1492. In many history books, the story is told that Columbus set out to prove that the world was not flat. History books often report further that many in his day really feared he would sail off the end of the earth. But actually, even in 1492, most educated people did already believe that the earth was round. So where did the story come from? In 1838, American author Washington Irving wrote a book of historical fiction about Columbus called The Life and Voyages of Christopher Columbus. A book of historical fiction is a work which is based on true events, but in which an author makes up a lot of the details that are unknown. In this case, for the purpose of adding excitement to his plot, Irving introduced the concept of the people's fear that Columbus might actually sail off the edge of the earth, but it has nothing to do with the true history. It turns out that the book was so well received that the fiction made its way into the history books. And so, as historians, we're going to examine documents. Some of them will be primary sources, and some will not. But with any source we examine, there are a number of questions we should be asking about the source. We may not be able to answer all these questions, but they should at least be in the backs of our minds. Particularly when dealing with written sources, we need to ask questions like, who wrote this piece? What do we know about the author? When was it written? Why was it written? Who was the intended audience? What do we know about the audience? Is the author trying to report history or persuade people about something? What assumptions contribute to our understanding of the source? Does this source agree with or contradict other sources? Does the author provide evidence for conclusions drawn? How close was the author to the event, both geographically and chronologically? We're not looking to doubt every fact that is presented to us, but we do want to ascertain why we believe what we believe about the past. In Acts chapter 17, verses 10 and 11, we read a very brief account of Paul's visit to the town of Berea in Macedonia. The people there are commended for having listened to Paul's preaching, but they did not stop with just listening. They also investigated what they heard from him to see if what he told them agreed with their Old Testament scriptures. I once had a teacher who often reminded his students that nobody gets a free ride. That is to say, just because an author is well respected doesn't mean he is right. As good historians, we want to draw conclusions that are based on the evidence available to us. We might not always agree, but we should have a reason for what we say history is.